Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. As a member of a minority community, jobs in the security apparatus are absolutely horrible. You experience large amounts of racism. You have no possibility of advancement. You're likely to suffer from things like PTSD and massive emotional trauma. When there are so many better alternatives, why would you encourage somebody you care about, somebody you love, to enter into this type of career? I'll be talking on 3 points in this speech. Firstly, on why this is antithetical to your values. Secondly, why this is bad for the child. And thirdly, why it's bad for the community. But firstly, on setup. Who is this community member we're talking about? We think that for the purpose of making this a clear debate, it's probably somebody prominent in your community, probably somebody like a community leader, just because they need to have, a substantial impact on mentoring the child or an influence over that child's decision for this debate to have any consequences. They probably also care about their community very deeply. They want to preserve the members, their culture, and the uniqueness of that community. We also think they're probably fairly defensive of their community just because of the high likelihood that this minority group has been abused in the past. The second thing to say in setup here is what we think discouragement actually looks like in this debate. We think that it probably starts quite young. So it's like telling the children of your community stories of how bad, the security apparatus jobs are, demonizing them, scaring children about them, telling stories about, what the police have done to your community in the past. We also think it looks like things like shaming people who leave the community to pursue these type of jobs. Now onto the first point of substantive here about why this is antithetical to your values. The important thing to note here is that, state apparatus have probably abused your community in the past. Like, of course, this debate exists in, any context, but we think that basically any of these contexts have abused minorities in the past. This can be from the scale of things like subtle racism or exclusion from jobs to things like genocide. Think about how the police in Australia are responsible for so many deaths of Indigenous Australians in jail. Think about the abuse of Hindus in India. Think about how, in Philippines, they are killing, drug users. We think that even if the security apparatus haven't directly abused the minority, which we think, actually is the case in most cases, they are still in charge of things like prison systems. They are definitely at least indirectly responsible. And you as a community member have probably engaged with them negatively in the past. Note the burden of the negative to disprove this point is to actually prove that the majority of minority groups have not been abused by the police or the military, which is just obviously not the case. We think that as a community member, you have probably lived or at least have historical recollection of your community's abuse by the security apparatus. You know about it, you're scared of them, you probably hated them, and you believe that they only do bad things to you and the ones you love. You therefore feel you have a responsibility to stop those you love, those you care about, from entering into those type of horrible institutions. Know that even if you believe that that kind of institution as a whole might do good, like you might respect that police are important in society, that doesn't mean you necessarily want to engage with them directly. Like, a lot of Black people in America still think that police should exist. That doesn't mean they want to meet them on the way on the night out. The second point in this speech is the harm that entering into these kind of jobs it occurs to the child. So let's assume that, the child then joins a job in one of these security apparatuses. So the first thing to note in this point is why you as a community member care about this child. This is probably because of simple things like you've seen them grown up, they're a reasonably important part of your life. And, the reason why you're probably a community leader in the first place is that you care about community development, you care about the people in your community, and you want them to, be happy and safe. So why are entering into these jobs so bad for the child? 4 reasons here. Firstly, we think that they require you to engage with people who are violent. So for example, if as a policeman, it looks like breaking up fights, arresting people against their will, dealing with things like domestic violence, or, in the case of border control, it looks like, tearing children from their families. It looks like returning people to war zones, and the military, you're forced to do a far bigger range of fucked up things. This leads to things like, PTSD. It leads to things like trauma. It leads to things like emotional scarring. Know that this is so much worse when you need to grapple with the fact that these things have been done to your community in the past, and now you are the one perpetuating them. That leads to even more emotional scarring. This leads to an unhappy life. And the second reason why this is so bad is that these institutions generally believe that they should, say have police of a certain background, be policing people of that certain background. This has been a way of potentially seeming woke, of trying to, stop some of the complaints that people make about, racism in these institutions. But this means that you're likely to need to, say, police your community or one that is seen as close or similar to it. So this, can look on the impacts of this can be on a scale of, locking up the religious leader of your community because they are seen as, opposing the dominant religion and ideology of the state. But it can also just look like some members of your community beginning to hate you because they now see you as an enemy. They now see you as somebody that has betrayed your community. Or it can just look like even like you forming actually relationships with members of the community. You might begin to like some of them and they might begin to like you because they're, sympathetic. You're sympathetic to them and their experiences, which makes it even harder for you and even worse for you to have to then send their son to jail. The third reason why these are so bad is that you have no possibility of promotion or advancement. Note that the power structures in these institutions are still dominated by the majoritarian people, and notably they're the majoritarian people who have been brought up with the view that members of your community should be viewed with suspicion, that you should treat them as potential threats. They've been dehumanize them so that, policemen don't feel bad about throwing a black kid to the ground and then subsequently arresting them. We think that this is a deeply entrenched amount of blindness that these security apparatuses have, traditionally encouraged. And these cannot be reversed just because now a black person is in your workplace wearing a uniform. We think that you might accept somebody of, this minority background 3 levels down, but people of the majoritarian community would never see them as an equal. This means you're probably not going to get promotions, probably not going to advance very far. The fourth thing to say here is that you're probably really pressured to abandon your culture. You probably want to fit more in with your white co-workers. You probably feel now ashamed of talking about your family and culture. And you probably feel scared to express that culture around a place which has so often mocked it, so often abused it, or so often seems to be opposed to it. What does this mean? It really impacts your relationship with your family and your community. It looks like things probably like not asking for time off like a Muslim in the military, not asking for time off for Ramadan because it's isolating from their white community. This not only impacts the child themselves, who has probably been raised to kind of feel a sense of importance of these things and associate them with their identity, but it also importantly abandons you and disconnects you from important support networks in your life. And it's probably going to make you extremely unhappy down the long run. We think these are horrible jobs for this child to enter into. Since you care about this child, you should try to prevent these harms from happening to them. You have an obligation to that child because you love them. The third point of substantive here is about the harms that this poses to your community. Now, the important thing to note here is that as the community member, you probably have, a lot of personal knowledge of that community. You probably know which families are engaged in crime. You probably know which families lack documentation. This means that, if you were to then join things like the border control later in your life, you're probably going to be highly pressured to disclose this information as a sort of, loyalty test to show that you don't have conflicts of interest. What does this mean? It means that that child who enters these kind of security apparatus jobs becomes an immediate threat to your community. And as a community leader, you don't want to see people you care about, your mates, your friends, the people, your neighbors, thrown into jail and separated. We think that therefore it is in both your interest and your interest as a prominent member of that community to stop these kind of abuses happening and to protect those you care about. Notably, at the end of this debate, we think that this is what is best for the child, best for the community, and as a community member, you should care about doing right by both of those actors in this debate. So proud to affirm.
I'd like to thank that speaker for the fine speech. Now I'd like to call upon the leader of opposition. Here.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yep.
Great. Great. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. As a counterfactual, we are perfectly fine with allowing children to enter into state security careers. And that's all, members of the community are inclined to do in such a situation, give them as much information and support as possible to guide them in this choice, whether it be bringing them to career fairs, talking to other community members in this job to get their expertise, and helping them go to academy, for example. We don't think this is any way exclusive to talking about instances of abuse within these situations, in the same way that we can tell a kid who wants to be a lawyer that the criminal justice system is flawed. In fact, we think this is all the more reason the child will be encouraged not to romanticize these structures factors, but believe that they can contribute to making a genuine change and reducing the abuse. Before I get into the arguments, which will first be that state security jobs are better than comparatively conventional work this child has access to, and secondly, that your presence in the system benefits the community, we will first have three responses. The first response is towards this broad principled idea that is somehow against your values. Note that the material they have here has several evidentiary gaps, but the most glaring one is that they set up the police as it currently is objectionable in some fashion. What they never argue is that why your intervention in that system would be itself objectionable. So what we dispute throughout this entire speech is that the presence of a child in this community will not worsen this violence or harm and will in fact reduce it, which means that their principled argument recurses into the rest of the pragmatics in the debate. So just saying that you have some theoretical principled objection does not immediately trickle to having a objection to this child actually intervening. Secondly, they say this is bad for the child. The first part they have here is that security is dangerous. You engage with people who are violent and so on. This causes PTSD and trauma. Observation one, we simply make the observation that as a member of a minority community, you may indeed be subject to these experiences still as a member of this community when walking down the street at night, for example, or when you have a family member that is an undocumented immigrant. And these are all situations where you may still face this violence, but you have no power or recourse against these things yourself as an individual. So the comparative would be that you do indeed have the tools to fight back against these things, either because you have the respect or the benefit of the doubt as a member of the state security apparatus, or you yourself have the advice to avoid this because you know what being part of the system is like. As a second observation, we also think that many of the comparative alternatives will be worse, will be more likely to put you in poverty, and we will illustrate that these are comparable on the level of harm because equally the situation of poverty, the situation of economic privilege is equally likely to put you in positions of violence, either indirectly through the means of actually feeling that hunger, which itself is a harm against you, or the actual feeling of being forced to steal because of the fact that you have no alternatives comparatively. So that's also the observation. Perhaps security may be dangerous, but they never engage with the counterfactual. They then say there's no possibility for promotion or advancement. This will integrate somewhat into our arguments, but I'll level the material now as a response. The first is it's just if you're right that there are much fewer people joining these jobs because it's dangerous, then because it's less competitive, you have far higher chance of being promoted or advanced in such a situation because you have a relative comparative advantage of actually being in the position to be promoted in the first place. Two, as you say, the police need to build trust with these communities and protect their public image so they have a direct incentive to promote you, even if they don't like it. All AF builds is that these white people don't like you, which might be fair, but it's not sufficient to prove that you will never be promoted or advanced. And thirdly is that, importantly, as they themselves say, the expertise you have about your community allows you to perform better at work and outcompete fellow your fellow policemen in that situation, which means that you are comparatively more likely to succeed, which means that you're more likely to get promoted or advanced. So there's a high chance of being promoted, especially in your unique position in such a situation. Having said that, then this transitions me neatly into the first argument. State security jobs are far better than any conventional work this child has access to. As a minority, it is incredibly likely that you have access to high-paying and fulfilling jobs. You probably live in a gerrymandered area, an underfunded school district, and that doesn't have connections or statuses. This could study as hard as they want and could be the top of the class and so on, but their degree will not nearly be as prestigious as other degrees, whether it be for finance, IT, and so on. But even then, in these communities, it's almost difficult to work hard, even if you wanted to. You, one, have many responsibilities because they often have 2 minimum wage parents hard at work. The 2, they live in a ghettoized neighborhood with many negative influences around them. And 3, lack the schooling infrastructure like well-paid teachers and good facilities needed in order to succeed. These are jobs that the average person wants to do as well, so you have so much competition, which often pulls down wages when there's too much labor available. All this means that many people in these communities do not have good outcomes, often ending up in back-breaking labor anyway, being forced to take 2 jobs, and therefore the harms of government at being put at risk can just as easily happen without the prestige that comes with state security jobs. On comparative, why are state security jobs, 1, immunized from the harms we've illustrated, and 2, better in the comparative? First, they're immunized on the comparative for many of the things we mentioned earlier because of the unique benefits you have as an individual. But secondly, is moreover, state security jobs have much higher salaries since these are jobs that put you at some level of risk that not everyone wants to opt into. Therefore, they have to attract people away from traditional jobs, meaning that it pushes against the labor depression, the labor wage depression that we illustrated earlier, which means that you have far more money to do things like send your kids to school and so on. But additionally, they also have a host of massive benefits because these security apparatuses are assigned prestige by the majority in the arms of the state. There are often tons of state benefits attached, like health insurance, pensions, free college from the GI Bill and education for your kids and free housing, all of which assure them and the generation after them have a much better shot of escaping poverty and the violence endemic to these communities. But thirdly and lastly is that the respect awarded to you, not only by people in your community, which may not meaningfully change, because even if they join this job, right, and maybe seen somewhat as a betrayer, they're still your family member. You don't want to alienate them. But the respect and status from people of the majority that are most likely to change meaningfully in such a situation is what will change, because you are seen as somebody that is protecting the community. You're seen as somebody that is, generally upholding the state, which, most people don't like, but white people like generally because the state benefits them. And so such a situation, we generally think that the respect and status would immunize you from many of the microaggressions, because the fact that they respect you as a soldier, this, I don't know why I did the salute, or respect you as like an immigration officer that works as part of the state. So as such, you're far less likely to experience discrimination in general. Moreover, secondly, you also experience far more demotivation. Note, if you have a chance to strongly discourage this child, there's a very high chance they're already planning to pursue this type of career. So there are two outcomes. The first, you dissuade them and they're in a career they're not so happy with, or two, you fail to dissuade them, but demotivate them in the present security career to a great degree. Note that in the second outcome, where you fail to dissuade them, not only do you have the same harms on AF, but you also have far worse outcomes for the reason that you suffer from a lack of motivation. That means you're less likely to perform well in school to get a good role. You're more likely to be hesitant in the actual boot camps and police academies themselves, and more likely to perform worse in the actual job because you're less likely to turn out. You're less likely to work overtime, which means that you're more likely to perform worse comparative to other workers. So all these outcomes substantially depress over time and get worsened because there's a debate-breaking outcome where they fail to sufficiently dissuade this person, but they still go, which means that they are far more demotivated and far more unhappy. But even the one where they are dissuaded, they're in a career they're not so happy with, which means that the harms we mentioned earlier are amplified because of the motivation multiplier and framing around that. At the end of this first argument, if it is about this child is far more unhappy, this child is far less likely to have a good life, and that's why it's already enough for us to support, to oppose this motion. Secondly, though, your presence in the system also benefits the community. One, your personal intervention is just plain good. Here we already illustrate that them just saying it's objectionable now will not mean it will continue to be objectionable. One, your personal intervention allows you to create more trust between the community and this arm of the state. Operations that would have otherwise been confrontational between a white cop and a member of your neighborhood are now much milder in comparison when it's another member of the community they talk to. Two, you're able to give advice from inside the system so that the community members know what to do to regularly update their visas and apply for a Dreamers application if they are an undocumented immigrant so they can go to college. And three, they're less likely to do abuse in other police officers because you don't want to abuse people in your own community. That's precisely why you're less likely to do this abuse in the first place. Much of this abuse is not ordered by people. It is done by overburdened, overworked white officers because of the fact that they don't know and they see these people as dangerous, where you're less likely to do that because you are from this community or you know what it's like to be in this position of this privilege. But secondly, is that you can also work within the system to change and influence policy. Many of the lawful actions of state arms don't take a large presence to change. They come from a strategic miscalculations because of a lack of information about the communities they're targeting, e.g. deciding to conduct a drug bust on the wrong part of the neighborhood because they can't talk to the minority couple inside. And you change these things directly by being involved in these operations. Beyond that, being able to climb the hierarchy through the three responses we said earlier allows you to drastically change things like deciding police allocations, stop and frisk presence in these communities. And we care because of the fact that we substantially decrease the discrimination experience overall, because your personal intervention is far more likely to change these things in the future. For these reasons, it should be sufficient on any one of these arguments to negate. So negate.
I'd like to thank that speaker for that fine speech. Now I'd like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Cool. I'm just confirming that I can be seen and heard.
Yep.
Awesome. I think that this negative team has a profoundly unnuanced understanding of what most minority communities look like across the world, because obviously it is not true that every minority child that we are talking about is somebody who's dealing with toss-up between homelessness or being a cop and has no other options. Most people have many other options, even if they are extraordinarily disadvantaged. There are plenty of other careers that you can access without having any access to university whatsoever. Those look like things like becoming a tradesperson, an electrician, a plumber, all of which you can do through apprenticeship programs. And often in many countries, there is a massive shortage of those types of jobs as well. It is not easy labor, but it will not give you PTSD. So that is probably a bit of a win for us. You can do things like go to vocational training facilities that allow you to become something like a mechanic or a firefighter or a paramedic. And I think that all of the mechanisms that they give you as to why some emergency services have shortages like the police probably apply fairly symmetrically to things like being a firefighter instead, but do not come with anywhere near the same depth of harms. Similar things you can do. You can probably participate in something like a small business that might exist in your community that looks like maybe working for somebody who's part of your community and advancing upwards, maybe eventually being able to do something like co-own a small shop with them or something along those lines. You can also participate in things like resource extraction-based jobs, which often require very little training, or the training is done on the job, which often struggle to find workers as well, and often pay extraordinarily lucratively. My dad became somebody who worked on oil rigs. He did fly in, fly out work. He only had a vocational qualification, education. And he was able to make a tremendous amount of money doing that. That is something that is open to many of these people who may not be able to access university, but can probably access something like a year or two course at a TAFE or similar vocational institute. So I think that they need to make it much clearer and deal with that much larger group of people who do have some access to further education or training, or just other entry-level jobs that would be much better than this particular entry-level job. The second thing they need to reckon with is the fact that in many instances, these children do have paths to university or higher education. It is not so bad that every minority cannot access university. That is clearly and plainly untrue. You have things like sports scholarships and pathways through that. You have things like some members of this community and some of these children probably are actually just academically gifted by pure chance or have particular drive to study very hard and might be able to access an academic scholarship. You have things like affirmative action programs. And of course, you have things like community or publicly run colleges, which have minimal or no education fees associated with them and which are able to accept a large number of people. If that child can access any of those things, they immediately have a far better economic outcome. And again, do not deal with the unique harms of working in the security apparatus. So those, I think, take out probably something like 60 or 70% of minority children to be somewhat conservative in terms of people who obviously have other economic outcomes or have other economic prospects that are not being a cop, are not being in the military. Like, you know, it is pretty obvious if you have ever been in a minority community or engaged with one, that of course, most of these people are not tossing up between only being a cop or homeless, and that's their only option. The important thing to understand here is that even if our trade-off is something like getting a job that pays you less than being a cop or a soldier would be, you also have to reckon with the unique harms that come along with that. I think most people would say that they would prefer to be something like a mechanic and maybe make less money than a police officer would, but you do not have to deal with the problems that come along with being a police officer, like dealing with domestic violence call-outs, which are incredibly traumatic for everyone involved, like dealing with arresting members of your community, like dealing with turning people away at the border, separating children from their families and telling them that they cannot exit the war zone that they have come from or cannot exit the place that they will be subject to violence from. All of that is extraordinarily emotionally intense, does leave people with mental illnesses at a much higher rate. Obviously, that is, I think, something that is worth a slightly lower hourly rate, but something that is probably still going to be sufficient to give you stable housing, food, and the opportunity to have a family, which is what most people value the most. And I think would care about, you know, if it was a trade-off between having something like PTSD or having a less economic, like a less nice house or eating less nice food or going out less, but still being able to be happy and enjoy engaging with their community, that's probably a fairly clear trade-off for us. The second thing to understand then is that neg's burden in this debate is much higher than what they think it is, because it is not just to prove that being a cop is good for some people, it is to prove that being a cop is better than the alternative. And we give you a number of those alternatives now, which I just think are obvious and intuitive, and they really should have reckoned with at first negative, instead of running on this bizarre characterization that it is being a cop or being homeless. Because of course, yes, again, then they do not just have to prove that being a cop is better than being homeless. They have to prove that being a cop is better than being like a chef or being like a mechanic or being a fly in, fly out resource extraction worker. The second thing that they need to do then is they also need to defend what they do on their side, because they're like, oh, we'll facilitate access for children who are interested. I would put to you that given the material we give you at Louise as to why these communities have been incredibly abused, have been victimized by these security structures, most children will not be interested in being a cop on their own volition, and they probably achieve very little in terms of a delta in this debate. They do not meaningfully increase the number of children entering these apparatuses, and probably what happens is largely symmetric, which is to say the very small minority who do literally have to choose between being a cop and being homeless will obviously always choose to be a cop no matter what the community leader says, because being homeless is awful, and you would probably always make that choice no matter what side of the debate is. They don't do anything beyond facilitating access, which I suggest means that probably they cannot get the kinds of institutional reforms that they cared about. Because let's be very clear here, this is a debate about a single community leader talking to a single child. Now, I'm willing to be extremely generous and suggest that maybe this community leader talks to many, many children, and perhaps they can achieve something if they wanted to take on a higher burden or a higher impact action, like getting an extra 100 kids a year, which I think is, again, insanely generous. Let's say they get an extra 100 kids a year to join the police or to join the military. That is a drop in the bucket when you think about how many thousands and in some cases millions of people are in militaries or are in police forces. That 100 children cannot be enough to get you meaningful institutional reform. What is their best case then? Their best case is probably that some of those children go on to police this specific community that they are part of. We give you, again, a number of harms that they fail to respond to at Louise that come from that, which is to say that it is likely that many members of this community that do not trust the police, that have been victimized by them personally, do not then trust these children anymore. They see them as narcs or as traitors. They are fearful of the fact that that kid
knows that they might be undocumented or might have access to the knowledge that they might be undocumented, might have access to the knowledge that maybe from time to time they happen to indulge in smoking a little bit of weed or perhaps growing a couple of plants, that I think means that these people are particularly fearful of these specific children who go on to be police because of their increased knowledge, because of their increased effectiveness, which is all arguments that negative gives you that mean that they are more likely to be treated with suspicion and treated fearfully. The final thing to say here is that, of course, it is not necessarily clear that people will trust you just because you look like them. That's pretty unnuanced. But also, these people, even if they're doing their best, even if they're being the most ethical cops they can possibly be, because they're starting out at the entry level, are probably still being commanded by people with incredibly negative white supremacist attitudes, which means that maybe this kid really wants to do the right thing when they're being a beat cop for the first time and patrolling these streets, but they're still going to be subjected to things like arrest quotas, things like being asked to stop and frisk people, things like being told by their superior that they have to do these things, they have to behave in particular ways when they go on domestic violence callouts, which means that even if they are on their first day, they have a high level of trust with this community. By the end of their first year, that trust is probably gone, and it is incredibly difficult to rebuild that once it is gone. The final thing to say then is that these children are not ones that are going to ever access the kind of power in these institutions that would allow them to make meaningful reform in their small number, right? It is unclear why these kids are going to get promoted. They say, oh, you have like levels of competence because you're from the community. But I would suggest that all the reasons for disadvantages that they tell you mean that this kid starts off with a less sophisticated education, starts off with probably legacies of trauma and mental illness from their experience as being a particularly oppressed minority, which all will impact on their performance on the job. So that better performance probably just does not happen. They don't even have the resources to do things like go to extra training that maybe their white colleagues can do. And they have to grapple with entrenched racism. They have to grapple with the person making the decision to promote them is somebody who has been told for decades not to trust people that look like you, to treat them as threats, to view them with suspicion. That is somebody who maybe tolerates you as a subordinate, but does not want you to be working with them, let alone ever above them. Let's then trade that off against the minuscule benefits they give to this child. Respect that is limited to your job and your uniform, right? I just do not think it's meaningful that maybe you get treated well when you're on the job by white people. You probably get treated badly by your community. And as soon as you take off that uniform, you're subject to the exact same racism. Not very big compared to the harms we give you. I think we are winning this debate pretty clearly.
I like to think that speaker for that fine speech. Now I'd like to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hello. Sorry. Hello. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. One moment. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So you can't just name a bunch of other jobs and then say that those are enough. The first thing I want to note is that there are many structural reasons that David explains as to why these were fundamentally different, i.e., one, that these things rely on an education that is often not provided for sufficiently in these areas. And they can't just say, well, some people can access a college education. To the degree that that is true, obviously we can't also ignore a bunch of structural inequality and say, well, some people can do it. In fact, what we talked about is not just that the access is sufficient, but also that the other things that might prevent you from meaningfully gaining that access, i.e. the difficulty of living within that community, the difficulty of gaining any political resource to make a good school, make it incredibly difficult. But secondly is that this debate applies most where these children, even given all these interesting jobs that they might want to do, would have still maintained that interest as to why that's why you had to discourage them. So in those instances, it either means these alternatives were insufficient, probably not well paying enough, because you would not have this discouragement has no effect on this debate if they would have done these things naturally. Obviously, this has to be a fairly compelling alternative in the instances that people are considering this. The second thing I want to note is they have to weigh against the comparative of discrimination. I'm going to talk about two different kinds of discrimination. First, in work, but secondly, if you believe that you're equally discriminatory within these jobs outside of work, while you are treated far better. The first, the in work. They say that advancement is far harder. They don't give any compelling mechanism to say advancement is possible on their side either. There are 3 reasons as to why advancement is possible. The first thing I'd want to note here is that it is harder because it is dependent on, as David says, your school district, the jobs that are available in your area, whereas state apparatus are more likely to be universal because they have a common incentive to develop police and soldiers to be as good as possible. Rather than when you have such a large pool of people, you don't need to develop these training institutions because you could just pick the ones that are already coming from the best schools, which is what corporations are currently doing. But secondly, again, it's less competitive because they can't just say it is so difficult to do that it might be put in harm's way. But at the same time that so many people might be opting into these jobs, it therefore proves that there's a larger capacity for leverage insofar as not many people are vying for the top spots. You have a greater ability to say, please don't treat me this way because you know that they need another man on the job. It makes it much more valuable for you rather than when you work as the same jobs that they say of manual labor, of unskilled work, and therefore make you far more likely to be replaceable. But thirdly, your minority status in this job becomes an advantage precisely because these are community or rather institutions that are needed most in vulnerable communities, yet as they say, have the least trust. So putting you at the forefront, saying we are assigning you to this region in order to curry favor with the community, obviously might not be the best thing in terms of morality, but is going to lead to far better outcomes insofar as they need you in order to ensure people trust the police again. But secondly is how you're treated. They say you don't want to converse with your white coworkers. I don't know why corporations and other jobs are going to be any less white. In fact, I'd argue the percentage of African Americans in the military is far larger than the percentage of African Americans in any other kind of work. And the reason for that is military and security jobs are marketed heaviest to low-income communities for the reason that people in high-income communities would have opted for some degree of skilled labor, probably would have gone to education and university instead, and therefore are not the most compelling fields. So I'd note, if forming groups, making unions, and trying to form connections with your coworkers is an important part of resisting discrimination from people above the hierarchy, they lose that part of the debate. But secondly, is that because these are state apparatuses, there are many laws that are likely to protect police officers from things like being unjustly fired, from things like making sure that their unions are very, very strong, that therefore don't exist also on their side of the debate for the reason that a lot of the jobs they do are far more common and therefore replaceable. So in terms of resisting discrimination, working within a hierarchy that also exists on their side of the house, they're not meaningfully compelling. Secondly, I want to talk about the community because they say you will hate your job and the people in your community will hate you as well. The first thing I want to note is the context of a minority community. It is overwhelmingly popular among poor people in the Philippines, the war on drugs that they name. 4 of 5 boroughs voted for Eric Adams as mayor of New York City when he was supposed to run on a tough on crime policeman rhetoric. The reason for this is, even if they don't trust the police, they also really don't like crime. They're disproportionately disadvantaged by crime. And it's much easier to hate. Maybe a complex and flawed institution like the police is likely to get some degree of favor. It is much easier to hate on criminals who are responsible for the many problems that they say are facing their community right now. So insofar as it is a comparison, I would actually argue trying to prevent crime within these communities because they see it the most, because they're the ones that are likely to suffer from its worst effects, is relatively popular. They can't just say people hate the police and therefore they'll hate you too. Here's the second thing I want to note. They say you will hate your job because you're doing all these different terrible things. I want you to assess the alternative. If you were not the person to arrest that black man, it might have been a white cop that would have shot him instead. I would note that knowing that you could have possibly prevented someone who is assigned to be your buddy on a job, you could have possibly been there instead of somebody else, is a notion that you feel you had directly served your community instead in this manner, rather than having an institution that is continuously flawed. They push this burden that, oh, well, people hate the police and therefore you would hate to be a part of it as well. It is completely actually, and for many people, wanting to contribute and become parts of flawed systems, to at least in your own part, contribute to make them better and reform them to some degree. Which is why many people from developing countries with crappy governments want to stay in those developing countries because they know they have some degree of role to contribute, not because they think it's a really great institution and government that they want to continue to support. But thirdly, I would note that you do feel heroic in a lot of these instances. But the same things that they say, you put yourself in harm's way, you put yourself in the line of danger. And in those instances, you feel like you are meaningfully contributing more so than any kind of job that might just be backbreaking manual labor, that might just be any corporate job that has no offering to your community, or it has like no semblance of you being able to build meaning in that corporate job. A lot of the time, being in this line of like security ensures that you get meaning because you are part of something greater than yourself, not just the job that you do. So insofar as, one, it is a wash as to what communities would prefer. I actually argue it is much easier to hate on crime than to hate on the police. But secondly, is that reforming the system of police while fighting crime is likely to be fairly attractive for many of these individuals. It is better. But here's the thing I want to note. I want to extend on discrimination that you feel outside of the workplace, i.e. the likelihood for you to feel microaggression, the likelihood of you getting a bank loan, the likelihood of people seeing you one way or another. There are three reasons you're far likely to be treated better. The first is that the claim against many of these minority groups is that they're un-American, they're unpatriotic. I would note that these are the most patriotic and nationalistic institutions that are most likely to affirm your citizenship and your belonging in these kinds of social circles and identities. The second thing I want to note is that for many of these minority communities, there's an association of stereotypes, of criminality, of you being undisciplined. This directly contradicts that, which is why it was incredibly powerful for many people to show the scars they've got from war in order to disprove any claims of them being un-American and undisciplined. But thirdly, it's just, I would say people just fear engaging in acts of discrimination against a state officer, knowing that there might be repercussions to these kinds of actions and therefore protects this particular individual as well. This is a particularly important argument because if you believe it's a wash in the workforce, I don't, I would still say the life you live outside the workforce, how you interact with other people, how you interact with other particularly discriminatory institutions as well, is at the very least far likely to be better for this one child and you knowing that you saved them from this life. So if we're more likely to succeed in our world, we win. But even if you don't believe that and it's equal, we think the possibility for you to advance in this world, to be treated fairly in this world, both inside and outside the workplace, but moreover, to feel justice within your own community is likely to be far better than an affirmative side of the house. I'm very, very proud to oppose.
I like to think that speaker for the fine speech. I'd like to call upon the Godhard here.
Just checking I'm both visible and audible.
Yep.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's start this speech with the claim from Mikko that says that we won't be able to dissuade anyone, and the debate is merely about the enthusiasm in which people conduct their job. Good. That is still a benefit. I'll explain why in our speech. But clearly the claim we make at Louise that you start this demonization early, it comes from a respected leader, probably does mean there's a great deal of internalization of those values by those children, and they are likely to turn to other things. I'm going to be bold here and cop that we would prefer those people be homeless and unemployed and work in these forces as this particular actor. But obviously Jordyn provides a series of reasons why these people are able to access relatively normal jobs because they're relatively accessible. And I think the competition mechanism from that team of, oh, but you have to compete with white people or the majority or whatever, is clearly the case. There's just probably enough jobs. But even if there just isn't, those people probably just work in jobs that service their own community. They start up their local bakery that isn't bought by white people or majoritarian people in that country. It is instead bought by your local community. And there's clearly still sufficient demand in this situation. An example to prove this is just to ask, do you walk into like minority communities and just see them all not have jobs or something like that? Obviously not. The vast majority of these people are able to access jobs. The debate is not, do these people have jobs or not? It's would we prefer they have these ones or relatively conventional ones that do not attract the harms we identify. I'm going to start my argumentation with the principle because it's actually something that's non-contingent in this debate and I don't respond to that facet of it. Then I'll explain the alternative jobs. I've done most of that already. Explain why this is best for community, noting that it's probably more important to this actor rather than the individual benefits to the few amount of children in this debate, and then, of course, engaging with those kids themselves. Well, let's talk about this principle. We explain, Louise, that this is antithetical to your values, and that is to merely support this institution by allowing members that you have some control over to access or enter into that institution. And that is an implicit support of something you find most disgusted. And that is obviously non-contingent because it doesn't matter if that person opting into that institution institution is important or not. It's something you have a very visceral response to as this individual. You do not want to encourage or you do not want to allow to happen. So regardless of the changes in the community or the individual, that's something that generates an incredibly disgusting feeling in one's stomach. You know you're doing something you disagree with. That is something that is contingent only on their side when they respond to David Africa to this argument by saying, well, we'll reform it so it's good for the community. So even if you do get those benefits, it comes at the cost of a deep distrust of your own stomach. You think this is the case. But I think the biggest problem with this argumentation is just that this requires an enormous amount of trust in the mechanisms provided by negative to be felt by this actor. It's not clear why this actor believes this person will go into this military and not abuse you back, or you believe they'll be able to reform them. Those are things that you probably can't internalize because you haven't seen it happen in your lifetime. You haven't seen other children that you failed to dissuade be able to do those things. And that means even if this is a response, it's one this actor doesn't feel. So I don't think it counts in this debate. Let's then talk about those alternatives. I think Jordyn's done a good enough job here. There's sufficient jobs. These economies don't lack the access of jobs or the need for them. In our worst case scenario, then they have these jobs only in their own communities and they're looked after in these ways. And that means the burden is that these jobs working in the military really must be far, far better rather than just not the only alternative, which I think far too much of this negative case has been predicated on. So the final claim then they make is, well, you access to a series of state benefits like healthcare or like respect or something like that. I'll respond to the respect component later, but I'll just note the healthcare comes at the cost of doing this job itself, right? You need that healthcare because you've got PTSD or you've been shot at, so you need that healthcare. It isn't part of the job to persuade people to join the military. It's part of the job because if you don't have that, those people can't do their jobs already. So it's not actually an independent benefit in the vast majority of the cases. And even then, things like GI Joe bills are actually not that common. They kind of is one example in the US post-World War II. It's not something that is overwhelmingly available in all contexts of this debate. So they're more likely talking about healthcare, which I've just proven is not sufficient. Let's talk about community. We explain that this is probably the most important thing for this actor because it is felt by most of the community that you care about, rather than the few amount of children that opt into this. So this is the more important clash in the debate. The first thing we explain here is that this actor that now joins those institutions is likely to be able to leak information about the behavior that your community does that is illegal or regrettable or plain out just like not having the correct amount of like legal paperwork or something to be in that country. And that information is likely to be teased out of this actor as a loyalty test if this person joins this community. So this is like saying, you know, what would you know about your community, or how would you police your community or something like that? And those questions don't provide an opportunity for people to kind of, we'll say we should reform this, because those people in charge of this organization are unwilling to listen to you. And I'll explain why before, but Louise has already done so. And this means that this information is leaked in such a way that important people of your community are either abused because the state now understands that these people need policing or are violent or something like that, or they do things like export them out of your country, kick them out because they don't have the right papers. Those things are clearly incredibly harmful for you as this actor because you feel a dependence or you feel an obligation to protect those people in your community. The reason that Louise explains to no response. You've probably been abused in the past. These people deserve your protection and you're incredibly protective of them. So I don't think you're willing for this to happen. They say, well, you actually can't dissuade the amount of people joining. This is our first explanation of where people not being enthusiastic is good. Because if you believe that you are forced into this institution, but you're unenthusiastic about it because you think it's a terrible one, then you don't trust it to do things like enforce that information you give them correctly. So you probably don't. You don't leak that these people don't have the correct papers, or they do some dodgy drugs in the backyard, or they don't pay their workers properly, or something like that. And that is a series of people that are no longer abused by the state because the state does not have that information under our enormous benefit. They instead rely on a question of reform. And I think this is an incredibly spurious claim from this team. The first thing to point out, as Jordyn does to no response from Mikko, is just the amount of these actors that you are now either dissuading or not accessing the community is very small. Even if you let every single one of them join the military, there's probably not that many of them, and they're unlikely to have particularly unified views. The second is to explain that the specific interactions they're talking about are ones that are often not controlled by their beat cop. It's probably controlled by their senior constable with them or something like that, which means that even seeing that person is also black or also brown or whatever is unlikely to mean that that person views them as someone who's friendly or more likely to engage with them decently. Because probably the first thing you do is have a fear reaction when someone says knock, knock, police, and you see the bad. You probably notice the color of their skin far too late in that situation. But you're probably ordered around by people anyway. So you're probably told you need to be fearful of them, or you need to be defensive, or we have a history with these particular people already, which means even if your best intentions are to behave well, you're unlikely to do so as that individual cop. So that trust is unlikely to exist there anyway. But this argument is additionally reliant on getting promotions. We explained that this competition of needing black people or something like that to appear woke does not explain why you need them in positions of power. You just need to demonstrate that they're and dole them out for a particular piece of promotion. But the biggest problem here is it's unclear why you want to reform this institution, because you'll probably take so long to get to that promotion, if you get it at all, that you're unlikely to still be inculcated with the values of your community to such a degree, because you probably needed to opt into the values of that force to get those promotions in the first place, because the deep-seated belief in the leaders of these institutions that the people of your community are bad or have behaved worse in the past, and it takes an incredibly long time to get rid of those values, probably can't at all, which means you need to opt into them rather than reject them. You will not get those promotions otherwise. So if you get promotions, you can't reform. If you attempt to reform, you do so from a low position that's not useful. On individuals, we explain you'll be asked to do a series of terrible things you have probably seen done to your community. And there's no getting around this. Even if you reform things, you're still asked to shoot at people. You're still asked to push people out of their homes or bust them or beat them up. And that is a harm these individuals cannot feel. They do not have, your community leader does not want someone you care about to feel such a deep hatred from your community, to be asked to do such terrible things. This is something that will make this leader feel most disgusting. They'll never be comfortable merely allowing these people to do it. This is a very clear affirmative to win.
I like to think that speaker for the fine speech. Now I'd like to call upon the upward here.
Hi, I'm just making sure everything's okay. I apologize in advance if you hear screaming from my brother in the background. He's grinding ranked. I assume it's stressful. Okay, I'm gonna guess everything's okay.
Yep.
I'll start in 3, 2, 1. It's telling that at first affirming, they say this debate is about the child you love and want to give a better life to. But by third, it's about protecting the community at all costs, that it's better that the kid grows up homeless, by God, as long as he's not a cop. I think this points to the fact that they neither provide this child with a guarantee of a better life or really provide any mechanisms by which conditions for the community improve. They do not build trust. They try to demonize this institution, but do not come to any conclusions about how life gets better. I want to talk about two things. First, the child's quality of life, both in this apparatus and in the alternatives, and next, how this impacts the community more broadly. Before that, I want to just extraneously deal with this principle so they can't pivot back to it at reply. It's incredibly unclear why the premise of this principle stands. E.g., I'm not sure why you as a community leader feel a visceral hatred for the institution as a whole, when, as we point out from Mikko, in many contexts, you probably value this institution quite highly because you see their role as protecting the community as particularly important. They assert that your first response to this is disgust. We would suggest that you are disgusted maybe at the abuse of members of the majority within this institution, but it's unclear why you see this institution as principally disaligned from your existence as a community. But secondly and importantly, there's no response to the context that this debate is actually about, e.g. the children you need to dissuade, which is why their strategy of asserting a host of alternatives that might exist for minority children simply cannot fly as a counterfactual in this debate. If they have a host of alternatives they can access, if they're getting a sports scholarship to Harvard, they are not the kids you need to dissuade from becoming a cop in the first instance. This is about the kids who already have a strong conviction towards that and probably don't have a plethora of alternatives to turn to. With that clarification out of the way, let's firstly talk about the child's quality of life. AF cannot demonize state security jobs without comparing to the alternatives that exist, and they cannot pivot away from this issue when they themselves say the child's life is the one thing you have the most certainty about. If you are unclear as to how you can change the institution or how the community will evolve in the future, what you ought weigh this debate on then is the socioeconomic position of this child. Let's first look at security jobs. They make two claims here. The first thing they say is it's a dangerous job, that it will force you to perpetrate violence against members of your own community. I think this falls for two very simple reasons. The first is we ask from the very beginning, where is this violence rooted? We say it's not inherent to the job. No police officer, like no police commander is going to tell you to shoot a black citizen or a black civilian point blank. That simply isn't how the law works. Many times it comes from misencounters. It comes when communication breaks down and both parties feel threatened, which means they act in a way that is contrary to protocol rather than in line with it. Crucially, that's something you can control as a member of the minority. You speak the language of that minority group. You can avoid being in that confrontational situation because you know the member of that community. If anything, here's how we flip this logic. If you are so absolutely demonizing this, not just to the children who need to be dissuaded, as we say, but to all children in this community, like you make it the blanket stance, you increase the likelihood that those misencounters happen because there's now more distrust, because they now view any encounter with the police as confrontational rather than first trying to have that dialogue, which could have otherwise existed in the counterfactual. So there's more violence that happens in their world in the long run. The second response to this is that the vast majority of positions in these arms don't put you directly in situations where you are going to get crippling PTSD. A lot of the time, it's things they themselves say. Things that like logistical planning. It's things like patrolling the neighborhood. It's things like communicating with communities, which by their own logic is the role you're likely to be put in if you believe that the State Department wants to look good. Compare that to the certainty of backbreaking labor and hazardous work, like working in oil rigs, which they give, a job which is notorious for occupational hazards, and having workers die early. But thirdly, even if you are in harm's way, there's no response to the way we give you from Mikko, which is to say that often this is still better and more meaningful. It gives you a chance to work with members of the community, to be with other people from your minority group, to be in a place where you are respected as an equal and at least valued by your employer, where the comparative is being just another cog in the machine. The second claim they give is to say, well, you can't be promoted. And I think they don't really rebuild this after our responses. All of their logic for why this institution needs you to protect their image, needs you to build trust with the community, and needs you to efficiently operate in areas they want to, suggests they care about you a lot and that you'd be able to uniquely perform in that role in a way you couldn't otherwise when you have to compete with majorities who have a bunch of other alternatives over you. But even if you don't believe you can be promoted, take note, a lot of the benefits we suggest are unique to these institutions aren't contingent on promotion. Once you work in the military, you're already guaranteed health insurance by the state. Their one response to this is to say, oh, well, that's unique to the US. Like, good job. The US is good, apparently uniquely good at providing social services. I just don't think that's the case. I think in many instances, these are institutions which are respected, which are valorized and romanticized, which is why they get this unique level of benefits they get. Like the fact that you have housing and you're fed for the period you are working in the military is already a massive thing for these communities. So in many instances, these are good and viable jobs. What are the alternatives? They assert a host of them. I don't think any of them work in the 21st century job market, which isn't even employing members of the majority. It's obviously not about kids who have clearly better alternatives like going to Harvard. They would have never gravitated towards going to the police or the military anyways, if they know it's as bad as you say. But what are the benefits for the kids who aren't able to access those alternatives? The kids who do end up in low-income blue-collar work. There are three things that just go unresponded to. First, the income, prestige, and benefits we already outlined. Next, the control over your quality of life outside of work. The fact that you won't be discriminated against by the majority. The fact that they cannot simply say that you are just a useless member of society when you are a member of the state and directly contributing to their patriotic narratives, as we outlined from Mikko. Third, the fact that you can protect others within your community. And this brings me nicely to the second issue about how this impacts the community at large. Their claim here is that the child will grow up to deport your friends and be an outcast within the community. First reason this falls. What's the comparative? It's unclear why if this child were not doing it, some white dude wouldn't have done it anyways. But we contend that that white person would have done it in a far more violent manner. Because you're right, they don't have information about your community, which is why they have to bust down doors. They don't have the trust necessary to conduct that dialogue and tell these people that they need to reapply for a visa before a certain period is over. They come when it's already too late and it's time to deport the family. But secondly, in many of these cases, you don't have to deport your friends and family because these situations can be avoided with knowledge about how these institutions operate. David gives you the example of the Dreamers Act. The fact that many immigrants simply don't know how to renew their visas or don't feel comfortable approaching the Department of Immigrations because there's no one there they can talk to and no one there that can understand the difficulties they had. That changes when you have a member on the inside who comes from that community and has that unique level of trust. But thirdly, the possibility of reform and the fact that we win the debate on promotions means that many of the times, these top high-level reforms about like where you allocate police, the methods you teach them, the training structures they opt into, are things you can directly change once you get to that top level. Even if it's just a few kids who do that, their impact is outsized and wins us the debate. The final thing they say is the community will see you as a traitor. And it's crucial to note that they don't come back to this after the response we give you from Mikko. In many instances, these communities don't hate the institution, they hate crime just as much. If anything, they're unlikely to see you as a traitor, they're likely to see you as a man on the inside they can trust and that they have an actual relationship with. At the end of the speech, it's clear. For the children who would opt into this, we provide them with the best alternative and we improve the community to the greatest extent negate.
I'd like to thank that speaker for the fine speech. Now I'd like to call upon the occupied to close off opposition case.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So I will examine the conclusions from affirmative and explain the assumptions you need to believe them, because if you don't, I think we overwhelmingly win this debate. 1, they trade off being homeless versus being disgusted and that it harms the community. My first response is just like, what? Like, there's no proof that the guaranteed harm of existing in poverty and being more likely to like not succeed is any better than some degree of guilt, because at best they say they will take the trade-off. They don't principally actually weigh why that trade-off is worth it. Secondly, this context is one where a kid was likely to have done this and needed discouragement. And therefore, it's unclear why that initial disgust would have existed to begin with. Because insofar as this kid might not have wanted to join this, there are so many compelling alternatives. The community is so anti-police, and I don't know what this discouragement would have changed on either side of the house. But thirdly, they just assume this disgust when we explain so many reasons that you probably to some degree would want to support or at least be okay with this job. 1, that many communities suffer the most from crime and therefore are likely to be anti-crime. Secondly, even if they believe the police is a flawed institution, they can believe that some degree of reform, having a man on the inside is a lot better than just having it exist as a whole. But thirdly, that a lot of the people who opt into this job do feel some degree of heroism for all the reasons we explain, of nationalism, of there being some valor attached to this job, of knowing you're doing good work and putting your life on the line for somebody else. Therefore, it explains, even if you believe that this is a community that hated the police so much and that this person hated them as well, it is such a narrow context in this debate that likely does not exist to the same extent that we explain our context. Secondly, that you won't advance and be discriminated. I'd first want to note that they name a lot of jobs, don't explain both the structural reasons for their access, but structural reasons for the likelihood of advancement here as well. What we explain is the difficulty of competition, the training to your geographic boundaries to things like your school district, the jobs that are available in your area are far more difficult to be able to overcome. And here's where their argument that it is a difficult job to do helps this case, because it proves that not only do we explain why low-income communities are most targeted, and therefore you're more likely to have more minority members here, and therefore they're more likely to come together, but secondly, that it obviously makes it a lot easier to advance. But uniquely, what we explained as well is that it is an advantage for you to want to be a member of minority. And at best, they say at third affirmative that, well, you just have to roll out some people. I'm not sure why this is true. When what we explain is that Korean trust and favor from the community, especially given their context of them not trusting the police so much. I don't know why just giving out a bunch of low-level cops and saying that that's enough would have regained the trust in that community as well. They cannot marry the context of this rebuttal and the initial context that they provide. So insofar as not only is this likely to be better for this individual child, but secondly, that it also means a greater amount of advancement and possible reforms you can make in the system are more likely to lead to bigger impacts on our side of the house. I think we win that. Because even if you believe that on their side of the house, this kid does some job, succeeds very well, it is, again, at best the context that only benefits that kid, which apparently they did not want the third affirmative. When what we explain is that if this kid succeeds, the ability to serve their community is probably going to be much better in the long run. But lastly, I want to note the lack of response to discrimination outside of work, how difficult it is to prove your citizenship and Americanness and patriotism, how difficult it is to prove you're not a criminal and you're disciplined and you're a law-abiding member of society. And therefore, if you believe that it would have been even on all metrics of jobs, which I don't think they are, the difficulty of having to face microaggression, the difficulty of engaging in many discriminatory state institutions makes your work far harder, but also makes your life far harder, insofar as they don't see you in the same way that you might have been seen on our side of the house, to break those kinds of stereotypes. At best, they say you'll be seen in this way at work as well, which one, they don't compare, but two, why it was likely on the comparative that you would have likely advance in this work to the same degree that would have allowed them to ensure that they could break free from these kinds of notions. For all these reasons, whether you believe it is better for the community, I already argued why communities probably positively view this, but even if you don't, it is far, far better for the child, though I think no comparative. I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank you all for reply for the fine speech. Now I'd like to call upon the last speaker of the House, God for reply. Here.
Just confirming I can be seen and heard.
Yep.
Wonderful. Let us be extremely clear about this debate. It is not a debate where the child is the actor. It is a debate about this community leader. And every single reason that we get from negative as to why this child is likely to be a particularly effective cop is a reason why this community leader is terrified of that possibility, is terrified that this child uses their community connections and knowledge to result in more people being deported, more people being arrested. And their failure to address that obvious and intuitive fear that this leader has means, I think, that they are struggling very highly in this debate. Let's talk firstly about the children who can only become a member of state security and have no other prospects. The first thing to say here is that they kind of assert a bunch of times that it is easy to become a cop without really explaining why it is easier to become a cop than it is to become something like a retail worker, where you might have the prospect of advancing to management, or to become a mechanic, or to access vocational education, which means that I think that this is an exceptionally niche circumstance, but one that we can still deal with. And that is to say, is it more productive to send that child into the police with a discouraging narrative, a skeptical narrative, or one that encourages and valorizes and facilitates that access to the police? And that is the response that we give you at Tom, and they fail to reckon with at Tobi, which is to say, when you encourage somebody to engage in these institutions that are harmful, and in particular, when you encourage somebody who is incredibly disadvantaged, who has little access to education, that it makes it much harder for that person to be critical and to leave, because that person feels like they are letting their community down when they do so because they've been encouraged by this leader, which means that they are less likely to be aware of the forces that are preventing them from advancing, or the forces that are resulting in them always being the person who gets sent to the DV call out and never getting the plum logistics jobs that they talked about. You're more likely to blame yourself. You're more likely to believe that if you work hard, you'll succeed. That's probably the message that the community leader gave them under their side to encourage them to take that leap. It is better to be discouraging them so that that child is actually skeptical and can look out for their interests within that job. So if you care about that, these 5 children and their interests, I think we do a better job of doing it. They're going to be cops either way, better that they be aware and skeptical of what they're getting into. The second thing to say, though, is that this is a message that we tell you at Louise starts very young, before these children are necessarily completely convinced of being cops or not. So we do actually get a meaningful reduction in people becoming police officers and instead focusing on other things. When you discourage them from doing that and instead encourage them to do other things from a very young age before they have a clear idea of what they want to be. So I think that means a clear positive benefit in terms of less of these kids engaging in the police and more of them engaging in things like vocational education, or more of them focusing on their sport and getting a sports scholarship. That's a clear benefit for us. Let's then deal with their institutional reform stuff. The important thing to understand here is that on the macro level, they get 0 because their numbers are just obviously way too small in an actor debate, which means that their benefit about improving the images of minorities also gets them nowhere, because you do not have enough children in your community who are joining the police to meaningfully change police makeups, to meaningfully change images. At the community level, they still are failing, I think, here, because even if we do accept that some members of this community value the police in the abstract, that does not mean that they value more police on their doorstep. And of course, the command structures that you are subject to mean that even if you go in with the best of intentions, you probably still do things that erode trust within that community extremely quickly. And in fact, your knowledge of that community and your effectiveness within it translates to more arrests and more trauma for that community, which is even worse. And you are pressured by your superiors to conform to whiteness to succeed, which alienates you further. It means that you're not likely to do things like attend cultural events. You're going to be ashamed about talking about your family, which further worsens worsens your effectiveness. It means that you're likely to feel more of a pressure to be worse in order to prove that you're not like them, you're one of the good ones, which is probably pretty bad. The last thing they give you is the idea that this person is uniquely able to educate this community about the Dreamer Act. It's unclear if education is what's necessary here. It's unclear if a lack of knowledge is the barrier, so I don't think they do enough to prove that one. At the end of the day, this trades off a clear risk of serious mental harm to this child, a clear risk of increased arrests in a community that does not want that, against very speculative and very marginal improvements in income. I think we take this debate quite clearly.
Like the thing that speaker for the fine speech now, like the thing everyone for that excellent debate. This is a silent round. So